But what I'm going to talk about today is the other aspect, which is what the Lisbon Treaty does for national parliaments and their significance. If you've looked at the paper which has been distributed, I've tried to place it within a wider context. I think you can't look at what the Lisbon Treaty has done without looking at the various formal and informal changes that have taken place over the last 20 years as regards the involvement of the national parliaments in the work of the European Union and in their relations with the European Parliament. I'm going into that in some detail, but I'm only going to very, very briefly summarize one or two of the key points there. Then, of course, we need to look at what the changes made by the Lisbon Treaty itself, but I'd like to spend rather more time on their potential significance and on some of their constraints on their full use, and then finally at the possible dynamic effects of the Lisbon Treaty. So beginning with the first point, some of the key developments that have happened as regards involvement of the national parliaments in the work of the European Union. I think the first point to develop that was in the 1980s there was relatively little involvement. But the first really significant development in many ways was the assizes in Rome, when there were 250 members from parliaments met to discuss the preparations for the Maastricht Treaty. A third of those came from the European Parliament, and 2/3 came from the national parliaments. And they ended up adopting a joint declaration which gave parliamentary guidance to the intergovernmental conferences that led to the Maastricht Treaty. Secondly, what does the Lisbon Treaty do to the role and powers of the national parliaments? I won't go into detail. In my paper, I hope, summarizes it in more detail. Just a few points. Firstly, I think it is quite important that they are now explicitly referred to in the new title on the democratic principles of the Union, as well as in the two protocols on the role of national parliaments and the application of the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. All this might lead one to conclude that the Lisbon powers of the national parliaments are only of limited significance. My conclusion, however, is a different one, namely that the real significance of the Lisbon Treaty for national parliaments lies less in the formal powers and more in the general impetus that is given to democratic accountability within the European Union, to closer national parliament involvement in the decision-making processes, and finally to practical cooperation between the European Parliament and national parliaments. The first point, that Lisbon will give new impetus of democratic accountability, I won't go into that, but I do think that the visibility is important. In terms of interparliamentary cooperation, I think that the dynamic effects of the Lisbon Treaty could be very considerable. I think they will lead to more detailed scrutiny of European legislation by the national parliaments. I mean, I can certainly see that already happening within the Irish Parliament with its limited resources I mentioned, and my understanding it's happening in many other national parliaments. They're aware of the fact that they should be more involved in this process and need to improve within their capacities and institutional constraints, strengthen their